Picture a man in a field, following oxen. It's 1232. The field is somewhere near a town called Arjona, on the hot, dry plains of what's now southern Spain, about 60 miles north of Granada. The man is in his late 30s, maybe 40. He has a red beard. He's wearing the clothes of a worker. Nothing about him, in this moment, suggests he's about to become a king. An old Castilian chronicle, written in the century after his death, says he had no other occupation than following the oxen. That's how his neighbors remembered him. A plowman, a farmer, one of the countless anonymous Muslim men scratching a living out of the red dirt of Al-Andalus, while the world around them started to fall apart. By the end of that week, a mosque assembly in Arjona will stand up after Friday prayers and proclaim him emir. 6 years later, he'll ride into the city of Granada through a gate called the Puerta de Elvira, dressed, an eyewitness says, like a Sufi, in a plain wool cap, coarse clothes, and sandals. He'll climb a red hill on the south side of the city, stand on top of it, and order the first walls of a fortress. That fortress will outlast every kingdom around it by 2.5 centuries. The hill is made of red clay. In Arabic, the fortress will be called Al-Qala al-Hamra, the Red Fortress. When Spaniards learn to say it, they'll pronounce it Alhambra. This man, the plowman, is its founder. His name is Muhammad bin Yusuf bin Nasr. Muhammad ibn Yusuf ibn Nasr. History will remember him as Ibn al-Ahmar, Ibn al-Ahmar, son of the Red. And the motto he's about to coin, just one sentence, a single phrase, is going to be carved into the walls of that fortress about 3,000 times. This is the story of how all of that started. To understand why a plowman in 1232 is about to found a dynasty, you have to understand what's happening to the world around him. And what's happening is, it's collapsing. For about 500 years, a huge chunk of the Iberian Peninsula, everything south of the Duero River basically, has been Muslim. Since 711, when a Berber general named Tariq bin Ziyad crossed from North Africa with a few thousand men and in a single summer campaign overran Visigothic Spain. For 5 centuries afterward, there have been caliphates and emirates and city-states and warring kingdoms here, all of them Muslim, all of them calling the land Al-Andalus. Cities like Cordoba, where the Umayyad caliphs built a mosque with 1,000 columns. Seville, the commercial hub. Toledo, the scholarly capital. Granada, an old Berber town in a fertile valley below the Sierra Nevada. By the early 1200s, all of that's unraveling. The Almohad Caliphate, the last of the great Berber empires to rule Al-Andalus, had been cracking for decades. And in 1212, at a place called Las Navas de Tolosa, a Christian coalition led by the kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, and Navarre crushed the main Almohad field army. It wasn't the end of Muslim Spain, nothing is ever that simple, but it was the end of any Muslim power capable of holding it together. After Las Navas, the Almohads retreated to North Africa to die slowly, and Al-Andalus fractured. Every city started governing itself. Every warlord started looking for a peace. The Christian kingdoms in the north smelled it. King Ferdinand III of Castile, a man who would one day be canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church, had been building his army, consolidating his territories, watching, and starting around 1225, he started moving south. The Reconquista, the long, slow, centuries-long Christian effort to take back the peninsula, had been happening since the 700s. For most of those centuries, it was a grind. A frontier raid here, a castle changing hands there. Cities would flip back and forth. But now, suddenly, it wasn't a grind anymore. It was an avalanche. In 1236, just 4 years after our plowman gets proclaimed emir in Arjona, Ferdinand III marches on Cordoba. Cordoba. Let me tell you what that means. Cordoba had been, at its peak, the largest city in Europe, the cultural capital of the Islamic Mediterranean. Its library was said to hold 400,000 volumes. It had running water and paved streets when Paris was still a swamp. The philosopher Ibn Rushd, who Europeans would call Averroes, had lived and worked there. So had Maimonides, the Jewish philosopher. The great mosque of Cordoba, the Mezquita, had been built in the 8th century and expanded for 300 years, and it was, by common agreement, one of the most beautiful buildings ever constructed. In 1236, it all fell. Ferdinand's army took the city after a siege. The Mezquita was immediately consecrated as a cathedral. The bells of Santiago de Compostela, which Al-Mansur, 2.5 centuries earlier, had brought to Cordoba as war booty and hung in the mosque as lamps, were carried back north on the shoulders of Muslim prisoners. The capital of Muslim Spain, after half a millennium, was Christian. And Ferdinand wasn't done. He rested a decade. He rebuilt his army. And then in 1248, he turned to Seville, the other great city of the south, the commercial heart of Al-Andalus, a port on the Guadalquivir with fleets and shipyards and warehouses and neighborhoods that had been Muslim since the conquest. And he started that siege too. Put yourself there in 1236. You're Muslim, somewhere in Al-Andalus. Maybe you're a scholar, a merchant, a farmer, a judge. You could be anybody. You've grown up in a world where Al-Andalus is the measure of civilization, where your libraries are the envy of Europe, where your astronomers, your mathematicians, your physicians are translating knowledge the Christians north of you don't have access to. And now, you're watching Cordoba fall. You're watching Ferdinand ride into the Mezquita, the greatest mosque in the Western world, and hand it over to priests. You're watching caravans of Muslim prisoners carry the bells of Santiago back north on their shoulders. And you know, because everybody knows, that Seville's next, and that after Seville, it won't stop. The question that hangs over every Muslim city in the south in 1236 is simple. Who's next? And then who? And then who? Because at the rate the Reconquista is moving, by the middle of the century, there won't be a Muslim ruler left on the Iberian Peninsula at all. This is the world our plowman is stepping into. What we know about Muhammad I as a man comes from one source almost entirely. His great-grandson's court chronicler, a polymath named Lisan al-Din ibn al-Khatib, who become a central character in this series, and whose own death in a cell in Fez we'll get to in part 2. Ibn al-Khatib, writing 120 years later, describes Muhammad I as a man of simple habits, pious without being ostentatious, physically strong, a cautious judge of men, the kind of leader who didn't wear finery because he didn't need to, who didn't give big speeches because he didn't have to, who, when he arrived somewhere, let the silence of his arrival do the talking. Ibn al-Khatib tells us he came from the Banu Nasr, a minor clan, not one of the big aristocratic Andalusi families. They were cavalrymen, frontier soldiers, the kind of people who'd been fighting the Christian raiders on the border of Jaen for generations. Middling status, nothing legendary. What Muhammad I had wasn't pedigree. What he had was timing and an instinct for when to act. When the Almohad state collapsed, local men started grabbing local power all over Al-Andalus. There was a man in Murcia who declared himself sultan, a man in Valencia, a man named Ibn Hud in the east, who for a moment in the 1220s looked like he might hold the whole coast together. Muhammad I stayed quiet. He built up his fighters in Arjona. He watched. And when the Friday prayers of July 1232 came around, and the men of Arjona stood up and looked for someone to lead them, he was there, ready, already known, already trusted. They acclaimed him, he accepted. What he understood, and what most of the other warlords didn't, was that the game wasn't about conquest anymore. The game was about survival. The Christian kingdoms weren't going to stop. Ferdinand III was going to keep marching. The Almohads weren't coming back. The cities of Al-Andalus were going to fall, one by one, like dominoes. Anybody who tried to hold a big territory, anybody who tried to actually rule the south, was going to get crushed by Castile. But maybe, Muhammad I thought, you could hold a small place, a defensible place, a place with mountains. He started expanding outward from Arjona. He took Jaén, he took Guadik, he took Baza, and in 1237, or maybe 1238, the sources differ, he rode west into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada and entered a city called Granada. Granada wasn't Cordoba. It wasn't the biggest prize in Al-Andalus. It was an old Berber market town with an ancient Jewish quarter and a few thousand residents in the river valley of the Darro. But it had something the other cities didn't have. It had a hill. On the south side of the city, looking down over the Darro and the plains of the Vega, there's a long, narrow ridge called the Sabica. It's made of a red clay, thick with minerals, that glows a deep rust color when the sun's at the right angle. Roman engineers had built a little fort up there centuries earlier. The Almohads had patched it into something larger, but nobody had ever turned it into a proper stronghold. Muhammad I looked at that hill, and he understood what it could be. He climbed it. Ibn al-Khatib's description of the moment is simple. The new emir entered Granada, we're told, dressed like a Sufi, in a plain wool cap, coarse clothes and sandals. No fanfare, no silk, no entourage. A man who looked like a farmer, going to look at a hill. When he walked through the Puerta de Elvira that day, he was walking into a city that was already old. The Jewish quarter around the Darro River had been there for centuries. The old Zirid fortress on the hill opposite on what's now the Albaidin, had been holding off raiders since the 11th century. There were Arab neighborhoods, Berber neighborhoods, Mozarab Christian enclaves. There were orchards climbing the lower slopes, silk farms in the Vega, donkey carts in the narrow streets, muezzins calling from half a dozen minarets at dusk. It was, by 1238, a minor city, a provincial place, nothing compared to the Cordoba that had just fallen or the Seville that was about to. But it was still a working Muslim city, and as Muhammad I walked through it in his coarse clothes and his sandals, it was probably the quietest coronation in a major Andalusi capital in 200 years. And then he stood on top of the hill and he gave the order: build. The Alhambra in 1238 isn't a palace. It's not what you'd recognize if you walked up there today. What Muhammad I starts building in those first months isn't beautiful. It's functional. It's military. He orders the construction of massive outer walls, built in rammed earth, a mixture of clay, lime, and pebbles compressed into wooden frames, a technique the Moors had been using in Spain for centuries. The walls go up along the entire length of the Sabika Ridge. They're thick enough to stop siege engines. They're tall enough that nobody's getting over them with ladders. He starts the Al-Kadhaba, the citadel at the western tip of the ridge, where the watchtowers go. That's where the soldiers live. That's where the commanders plan. Anyone attacking Granada from the west, from the direction of Cordoba or Seville, hits those towers first. He has cisterns dug into the hill, deep ones, because the one thing that kills a fortress faster than anything else is thirst. And if the siege ever comes, whoever's in here needs to be able to hold out for months. He builds barracks, he builds stables, he builds arsenals. What he isn't building yet is anything that would make you say the word Alhambra and think of what you've seen in photographs. No court of the lions, no hall of the ambassadors, no poetry on the walls. Those are 2 and 3 generations away. What Muhammad I is building in 1238 is the kind of place his grandsons could die defending. And here's the thing about him, which we forget looking at photos of the finished palace. Muhammad I wasn't building for beauty. He wasn't building for posterity. He was a practical man, a cautious man, a man who'd grown up on a farm and knew what it took to keep a kingdom alive. He was building a fortress because he was planning, from the very beginning, for the siege that he knew had to come. He just didn't know it'd take another 250 years to arrive. Because here's what happens next. And this is the part of the story that Muhammad I's dynasty would never quite live down. Ferdinand III of Castile is now sitting on Cordoba. He's preparing to move on Seville. His army is the largest Christian force Spain has seen in centuries. And Muhammad I, sitting on his new hill in Granada, does the math. He can't beat Ferdinand. Nobody can beat Ferdinand. He can try to form a coalition with the other surviving Muslim emirs, but they're all watching each other, all jockeying for position, and none of them trust him because he's new and he's small. He can try to get help from the Marinids of Morocco, who are rising in North Africa, but they're busy with their own wars and they're not crossing the strait for him. Or he can cut a deal. In 1246, Muhammad I travels north, in person, to meet Ferdinand III. They meet at Jaen, one of the cities Muhammad I had taken in his early campaigns, one of the cities he's now formally giving up. The Treaty of Jaen gets signed. Muhammad I becomes a vassal of the King of Castile. He swears fealty. He agrees to pay parias, tribute, amounting to roughly half of his emirate's annual revenue, every year, to the man who just took Cordoba. Think about that. The founder of the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, the man who'd just been proclaimed emir by his people, who'd built a fortress to defy the Reconquista, kneels in front of the Castilian king and agrees to fund his war against the rest of Al-Andalus. And that's not the worst of it. 2 years later, in November 1248, Ferdinand's army is at the walls of Seville, and Muhammad I, under the terms of his vassalage, is obligated to provide troops. So he does. Nasrid cavalry, his own men, ride with Ferdinand's army into the second great capital of Al-Andalus, the city where his grandfather's generation had worshipped, the city that'd been Muslim since the conquest 5 centuries ago, and they helped take it down. Seville falls. The mosque becomes a cathedral. 100,000 Muslims are expelled from the city in the years after. And Muhammad I, who just helped his enemies seize the second most important city in the Muslim world, rides back to Granada. When he gets there, the crowd comes out to meet him. He's returning from a victorious campaign after all. He's on the winning side. People line the streets, and as he rides in, the crowd starts shouting the traditional salute for a victorious warrior. Al-Ghalib lillah, victor for God. And Muhammad I, sitting on his horse, hearing his own people call him a victor for his role in the fall of Seville, pauses. And then he says, loudly enough that everyone hears it, a sentence that'll outlast him and his dynasty, and probably most of Europe's current kingdoms. Wala ghalib illallah. There is no victor but God. That one line is maybe the most important sentence in this whole story. So let's sit with it for a minute. On the surface, it's just piety, a king deflecting praise, redirecting glory to God instead of himself. Traditional Islamic humility, nothing unusual. But read it again in the context of what had just happened. He'd helped take Seville. His people were calling him a victor, and what he said was, "No, I'm not a victor. There's only one victor, and it isn't me." That could be shame talking. The public acknowledgement that what he'd done, helping Ferdinand take a Muslim city, wasn't actually a victory, that it was an act of political survival wearing the costume of victory, that the only real victor in any of this was the God who saw it all. Or it could be something harder. It could be a kind of theological consolation for a man who understood, better than anyone around him, that his kingdom had just bought itself maybe a generation of peace by betraying the kingdom around it. That there was no glory here, only God, and the hope that God knew what he was doing. Or, and this is the reading that modern scholars lean toward, it could be political cover, a way of saying in public that he didn't consider himself bound by the normal rules of kingship, because he just acknowledged that he was only a temporary placeholder for God's will. If you're not really the victor, if you're just a man, a placeholder, then you can do things a real king couldn't do. You can kneel to a Christian, you can help take Seville, you can pay tribute, you can survive. Whatever it meant to him, here's what happened. His grandchildren took that phrase and they carved it, literally, into stone, into plaster, into tile, into every inch of wall they could find in the fortress their grandfather built. The best estimate we have from a Spanish scholar named Juan Castilla Brazales, who spent years cataloging every Arabic inscription in the palace, is that "Wala ghalib illallah" appears on the walls of the Alhambra about 3,000 times. 3,000. On every tile, around every doorway, woven into every geometric pattern, in every room where a visitor might sit, or pause, or look up. The motto of a plowman king who'd helped his enemy destroy the civilization he belonged to, hammered into the walls for 600 years. Every few steps. You can't walk 10 paces in that building without reading it. There is no victor but God. There is no victor but God. There is no victor but God. Every time you enter the palace, and every time you leave it, and every time you turn a corner, the walls tell you the same thing over and over, that whoever's currently winning, it isn't really them, that the only victor is the one watching. It's the founding myth of the dynasty, and as the centuries go on, it becomes something stranger, because the Nasrids are always losing, slowly, bit by bit, year by year. They're paying tribute, they're ceding territory, they're watching their cities fall, one by one. And the more they lose, the more the motto on their walls becomes a kind of quiet defiance, a refusal to acknowledge in public that the losers are them. There is no victor but God. So the winners, the ones marching south, the ones taking the cities, they aren't really victors, they're just kings. The real victor isn't here yet. Here's the question that everybody who studies Muslim Spain eventually asks. How did it last? Because from where Muhammad I stood in 1248 on the walls of his new fortress, looking out over a kingdom that had just formally acknowledged itself as a tributary of Castile, the math didn't look good. The Reconquista was accelerating. Ferdinand III was going to die in 1252, but his son Alfonso X, called the Wise, was going to keep pushing. And the expectation in Christian Europe, the expectation in Rome, where successive popes were calling for new crusades against Al-Andalus, was that Granada was the last piece of a puzzle that'd be finished within a generation. It wasn't. The Nasrid dynasty of Granada would last 254 years. Longer than the Roman Empire's western half. Longer than most European royal houses that exist today. Longer by a wide margin than the United States has been a country. How? There are 3 answers, and they all matter. Let me take them one at a time. The first is diplomatic agility. Muhammad I wasn't the last Nasrid emir to understand that the only way to survive was to play the Christian kingdoms against each other. Castile, Aragon, and eventually Portugal, all three of them wanted pieces of Spain. And all three of them occasionally hated each other as much as they hated the Muslims. The Nasrid spent the next 2 centuries playing them, making deals with Aragon to pressure Castile, making deals with Castile to neutralize Aragon, paying Morocco to invade when they needed a distraction, sending ambassadors, bribing courts, gathering intelligence. It was exhausting work, and it required every emir to be a part-time diplomat, and it worked. The second answer is geography. Granada sits in a valley protected on the south and east by the Sierra Nevada, the tallest mountain range in Spain. Real mountains, snow on the peaks until July. The passes are narrow, the terrain's rough, and an invading army has to commit enormous resources to get through. On the other sides, Granada had heavily fortified cities. Malaga on the coast, Almeria further east, Baza inland, each one a major operation in itself. It wasn't impossible to take, but it was hard. And for most of the centuries after 1248, Castile had cheaper wars to fight first. Which is the third answer. Castile was almost always busy. The Trastamara civil wars in the 1300s, the Black Death in the mid-1300s, constant succession crises, English pirates in the Bay of Biscay, the Kingdom of Portugal on the western border, wars with Aragon over the eastern border, revolts by the nobility, sometimes just straight-up bad kings. For most of Granada's long existence, Castile had something more urgent to do than finish off the last Muslim kingdom, and the Nasrids were careful to never, ever give Castile a reason to prioritize them. So Granada lasted, generation after generation. They paid their tribute, they sent their ambassadors, they survived every succession crisis, every famine, every plague, every internal revolt. They stayed small and careful and quiet, and somehow through all of it, they kept building. Because something strange starts happening in Granada in the decades after Muhammad I's death in 1273. You'd think, living under this constant pressure, always on the edge of annihilation, you'd think the place would be grim, militarized, narrow. It isn't. It becomes instead one of the most active cultural centers in the Islamic Mediterranean. Refugees keep coming in, scholars from Seville, poets from Cordoba, judges from Valencia, Muslims who've lost their cities in the north and the east, pouring into the one place left that'll still have them. They bring their libraries, their schools, their trades, their memories of a larger world, and they feed all of that into Granada. The fortress Muhammad I built starts getting expanded. New palaces, new gardens, new courtyards, new poetry carved into new walls. A Maristan, a hospital, with a special ward for the mentally ill, centuries ahead of anything in Christian Europe. A madrasa, teaching law and theology to students from as far away as Morocco. The city itself triples in population across the 1200s and 1300s. The old Berber market town becomes a real city. The neighborhood on the hill opposite the Alhambra, the Al-Bayzin, fills up with Muslim refugees from every lost city in Al-Andalus. The whole slope becomes a maze of whitewashed houses and narrow-stepped streets, courtyards with orange trees, jasmine climbing up the walls. Silk workshops open, paper mills. The bazaars fill with textiles from Damascus, spices from the Hejaz, books from Fez. If you stood on the Alhambra walls at sunset, you could hear the call to prayer rising from 24 mosques at once, and you'd know you were listening to the last fully Muslim city in Europe. Everybody living in it knew they were somewhere temporary. And because they knew it, because they understood, in the back of every mind, that this could be the last generation, they lived the way people live when they're trying to get everything they love into one place before somebody takes it away. The kingdom that's always losing keeps producing things too beautiful to make sense. But there's a shadow, and we need to talk about it, because it's what shapes every Nasrid reign after Muhammad I. His son, Muhammad II, took the throne in 1273, peacefully, after his father's death in a horse-riding accident. Muhammad II was a quiet scholar known as al-Faqih, the jurist. He consolidated his father's gains. He kept the kingdom together. He reigned almost 30 years. He died in 1302, an old man. Then his grandson, Muhammad III, took over and reigned 7 years, and was deposed by a palace coup led by his own half-brother, and went blind in prison and died. Then the half-brother Nasr reigned 5 years, and was deposed by his cousin and died in exile. Then the cousin, Ismail I, reigned 11 years, and in 1319 he won the biggest Nasrid military victory against Castile in the dynasty's history. Here's what happened. In June of 1319, two Castilian royal regents, the Infantes Pedro and Juan, both uncles of the young King Alfonso XI, both running the kingdom while he was still a child, led a large army down into the Vega of Granada, the fertile plain below the city walls. Their plan was to burn the orchards, the mills, the outlying villages, and force Ismail I to surrender on whatever terms they wanted. Ismail rode out to meet them. The battle was short and brutal. The Infante Pedro was killed in the fighting. The Infante Juan, younger, not yet 20, was thrown from his horse, trampled, and died of his injuries the next day. Both royal regents of Castile, killed in a single afternoon, within sight of the Alhambra walls. The Castilian army broke and ran, leaving hundreds of dead on the field. It was a triumph, the kind of thing you'd expect a king to celebrate for decades. 6 years later, in 1325, Ismail I was murdered by his own cousin. The sources disagree about why. One story says it was a personal quarrel over a captive Christian woman. Another says it was over a prior insult at court. A third says it was just politics. What we know is that the cousin stabbed him 3 times, in an embrace, at the end of a court audience, at the Alhambra, in a hallway. The victor of the Battle of the Vega, stabbed in the corridor of his own palace by his cousin in the embrace of reconciliation. This becomes the Nasrid pattern. You could call it the curse of the dynasty. Every emir starts to look at every family member as a potential assassin. Every coronation has to worry about who's going to be in the room with the knife. The court at the Alhambra is simultaneously the most refined space in the Western Mediterranean and the most dangerous place in it for the person sitting on the throne. Ismail I's murder is the first one, but it isn't the last. His son Yusuf I takes the throne at 15, a boy king in a palace where his father was just killed. He reigns for 21 years, survives the catastrophe of 1340 when a combined Nasrid-Marinid army is crushed by Castile and Portugal at the Battle of Rio Salado on the Atlantic coast. After Rio Salado, no Muslim army from North Africa will ever invade the Iberian Peninsula again in force. The Marinids retreat to Morocco. The Nasrids are left alone, surrounded, a Muslim island in a Christian sea. Yusuf I does something in 1349 that's worth pausing on. Alfonso XI of Castile, the same Alfonso who'd won Rio Salado, is besieging Gibraltar. The Black Death arrives, and Alfonso dies of it, right there in his siege camp in March 1350. His army has to retreat north with his body. The Castilian funeral cortege is passing through territory that's still under Muslim raider threat. The Muslim forces could easily hit them, take the body, disrupt the retreat. Yusuf I orders his troops to stand down, to let the funeral cortege pass unmolested, to treat the dead Christian king with the courtesy owed to a king. It's the kind of gesture, quiet, unforced, gratuitous, that you don't expect from someone whose father was stabbed to death by a cousin 25 years earlier. But that's who Yusuf was, a man who'd seen the worst of his family and chose, when he could, to be better. He builds the Comares Tower, rising above the Court of the Myrtles, the great cubic throne room where his son, years later, will install a cedar ceiling of more than 8,000 interlocking pieces carved into 7 tiers, each tier a different color to represent the 7 heavens of Islamic cosmology. He builds the Puerta de la Justicia, the grand horseshoe-arched gate that's still the main entrance to the Alhambra today. He starts the Madrasa Yusufiya, the law school that'll teach jurisprudence to students from across the Maghreb. He patronizes the scholars. He keeps the peace. He cultivates the sense that Granada, whatever else it is, vassal, tributary, always losing, is also a place where the finest Muslim civilization left in the Mediterranean is being quietly, insistently assembled. One palace, one madrasa, one poem carved into one wall at a time. In 1354, during Eid prayers at the Great Mosque of Granada, an attacker lunges at him with a dagger. The sources, including Ibn al-Khatib's, can't agree whether it was a madman or a conspiracy. What they agree on is that Yusuf I, the man who let Alfonso XI's funeral pass in peace, was stabbed to death in the middle of Eid prayer, on the day of celebration, surrounded by his own people. He was 36 years old, and his son, a 15-year-old named Muhammad V, took the throne. That 15-year-old is going to build the Court of the Lions. He's going to oversee the peak of the dynasty, the golden age, the moment when the Alhambra becomes the Alhambra. He's also going to inherit every wound his family has carried since 1232, the bargain at Jaen, the kneeling to Ferdinand, the cavalry at Seville, the murdered grandfather, the murdered father, the motto on the walls. But that's the next episode. Let's come back to the plowman. 1232, a field near Arjona. A man in his late 30s, following oxen, with no reason to think he's about to become a king. When the mosque assembly acclaimed him that summer, he probably didn't know what he was starting. He couldn't have known. He was doing what the moment required, stepping up because somebody had to, because his community had asked him to, because the alternative was to keep plowing while the world around him collapsed. 6 years later, he climbed the Red Hill and ordered walls. He built a fortress for a war he knew was coming and didn't live to see. He kneeled to a Christian king because he understood, before anyone else in Al-Andalus understood, that the old categories weren't going to save his people anymore. That survival was going to require doing things that looked, from the outside, like betrayal. That he was going to have to carry the shame of Seville for the rest of his life, and hope that his grandchildren could forgive him, because the alternative was that there'd be no grandchildren at all. He died in 1273 after falling from his horse, 35 years into his reign. The last image his chroniclers give us is a tired old man who knew what he'd bought and knew what it cost and knew it probably wouldn't be enough. But the thing he built kept going. For 254 more years, his descendants ruled from the fortress on the hill. They added palaces, they added gardens, they added poetry to the walls. They fought each other, killed each other, deposed each other, forgave each other. They paid their tribute year after year. They watched, generation by generation, as the territory around them shrank. And all the while, on every wall they built, in tile and in plaster and in stone, they carved the sentence their founder had said on the road back from Seville. وَلَا غَالِب إِلَّا اللَّهِ. There is no victor but God. If you go to Granada today, you can walk into the Alhambra and you can read it 3,000 times, over every doorway, around every arch, in every room. It's the first thing you see when you enter and the last thing you see when you leave. The motto of a dynasty that was always losing, on the walls of a building that somehow won. Next time, we're going to step inside that building. We're going to meet the poet whose verses are carved into the walls of the Hall of the Two Sisters. We're going to meet his teacher, who was strangled in a Fez cell and whose body was dug up and burned. We're going to watch the greatest philosopher of the medieval Muslim world walk the halls of a palace still under construction and refuse an offer that would have made him rich. The Court of the Lions, the Hall of the Ambassadors, the Alhambra at its peak, the palace that is a book. I'm Basil. Thanks for listening.